Recently, I got to experience the Star Wars Secrets of the Empire VR experience in Orlando, and simply put, it's incredible. It's impossible not to be awestruck when you feel a blast of heat as you step out on a Mustafar, get vertigo looking down the seemingly bottomless pits of an Empire base, or feel a rush as you instinctually pick up a blaster and start shooting stormtroopers, all while really in a space no larger than a one-bedroom apartment. And yet, I didn't leave the interactive experience thinking that things like this were necessarily the future of theme parks. There's a moment towards the middle of the experience where I approached a terminal with a series of colored buttons I needed to use to open a vault. The buttons began flashing in a sequence like a game of Simon, but before I could memorize the pattern, I started getting shot by some AI stormtroopers in a nearby window. My human allies started covering me, but I was so distracted and stressed out by the chaos, I totally failed to beat this minigame that should have been easily doable for anyone at a 3rd grade level. After failing 3 times, the terminal itself just exploded, and we were mercifully allowed to continue despite my total failure. Secrets of the Empire may be one of the most transporting experiences I've ever had, but its design also highlights almost all the challenges that make bringing an interactive experience to a theme park so incredibly difficult. My name is Greg Grabaric, and welcome back to the Q-Line Lectures, a series about theme park design. At the end of my last video about the theme park monomyth, I mentioned that a common issue I see with ride narratives is that they cast the rider as helpless onlookers to a larger conflict. This design choice can really work well in certain situations, but it also limits your ability to empower the rider to feel like an active and important participant in the story. This is directly in conflict with the way designers are talking about the changing theme park experience.
All these great Star Wars stories have a new twist. This time, you're invited to participate with them in your very own Star Wars adventure.
It's clear that with each new major expansion, designers want to push the level of immersion thought possible forward, but there's a limit to how immersive an experience can be while the guest is still forced to be passive. So how do we get around this? How do we make riders feel like the core of a story that revolves around them? Well, just a quick look at the rumor mill would make it pretty obvious that interactivity is going to be a key to solving this problem. Disney has filed patents for a Captain America shield throwing mechanism, Universal has made it clear that we'll have some level of control over our Mario Kart experience, and of course, Galaxy's Edge has been touted as being a world that responds right back to your actions.
Opportunity for us to find ourselves in the cockpit of the Millennium Falcon and take the controls ourselves from one of the fastest ships in the galaxy. But just remember, as we've announced before, this is a living place, a place where your choices matter, and a place where you can even earn a reputation. For example, if you prove to be one of the hottest flight crews in the galaxy, you might find some extra galactic credits coming your way. But if you bring back the ship all banged up, well, the boss might not be too happy. You might even end up on the list of a local bounty hunter.
So why is everyone jumping behind interactivity as potentially the next big idea in ride design? It comes down to interactivity's ability to give the rider what we'll call agency. In writing, we talk about characters having agency to mean they drive the action of the story. They cause things to happen, rather than let things simply happen to them. Maybe more related to interactive rides, however, is player agency in video games. Player agency can be derived from tons of systems in a game, but ends up working pretty similarly to how it does in writing. Agency can sometimes come from clearly presented choices, like those in Telltale's adventure games. Do you trust this stranger, or leave him to die? These choices leave little ambiguity to the player about how they are affecting the story. But agency can also come from more mechanically complex choices, like those found in Fallout or Skyrim, where choosing where you go, what you do, how you level up your character, and more all contribute to the essential power fantasy. Agency hopes to build the illusion that you can go anywhere and do anything. But why does it ultimately have to be an illusion? What factors limit interactivity to only provide a simulacrum of true agency? Well, that's what I hope to get into with Galaxy's Edge, and specifically the upcoming attraction, where you and a crew pilot the Millennium Falcon on a dangerous and exciting mission. This isn't meant to be a negative video. On the contrary, I'm super excited for what's being done with Galaxy's Edge. But it's worthwhile to have a look at all the difficult design choices that go into making a narrative ride feel interactive. So what makes true rider agency feel like sort of a pipe dream? The Millennium Falcon will be far from the first ride to promise this kind of experience, and looking back at prior examples of interactive rides can really tell us a lot about why chasing this goal can be both a blessing and a curse. I think what first comes to mind as interactive experiences are shooting gallery type rides. Be they practical like Buzz Lightyear's Space Ranger Spin, or digital like Voyage to the Iron Reef, these all basically offer the same type of experience. You move from scene to scene, shooting targets, trying to get the highest score. These rides liberally borrow structures, rules, and mechanics directly from video games, which is a large part of their success. Your freedom to shoot targets offers undeniable control, but I don't think any rides of this type offer substantial attempts at narrative agency. Sure, your laser blasts often cause the targets to react and shake, but your ability to hit enemies has no effect on the overall ride, beyond just a big number on the final screen. This can leave the more narratively ambitious rides like Men in Black Alien Attack feeling more hollow or artificial than standard dark ride takes on similar subject matter. After all, it's hard to even notice there's a story going on when the ride demands you constantly be spraying lasers every direction if you want any hope of besting your friends. I think rides of this type are best when they embrace their old school inspiration, just like Toy Story Midway Mania, and own up to being nothing more than a souped up carnival game. A less obvious example of interactive ride design would be the Epcot classic Horizons. The end of this ride, about an optimistic vision for the future, featured 3 different video segments about different habitats of tomorrow that would be swapped in based on what riders in each vehicle voted for. This exactly parallels the direct choice style of a Telltale game, and it's impossible to deny that riders do have control over the narrative. And yet, this doesn't quite capture the full flavor of agency, as the boundaries of what you can do are so plainly obvious. There aren't limitless endings, there are 3, each fully embodied by the physical plastic button in front of the rider. The narrative is allowed to change, but it does so with such obviously constrained boundaries that it's hard to see the choice as anything more complex than choosing between chocolate, vanilla, or strawberry ice cream. You might have been excited to see how Disney evolved that concept of interactivity with their Horizons replacement, Mission Space. Well, gone are the obvious outcomes tied to a strict set of 3 buttons. Now each rider only has a single button, and at a specific and climactic moment in the ride they are instructed to press it. And what happens if they don't, you ask? Well, nothing, actually. Despite all the show and faux agency, Mission Space isn't an interactive ride at all. It just uses the trappings of one to attempt to add some believability to your story of being the crew training for a spaceflight. There isn't much available online about the design choices behind including these buttons, but they are so pointless that I have to believe they are vestigial remnants of conceptual iterations of the ride that actually changed depending on whether your crew worked together to perform all their assigned roles. What challenge could have been so daunting that Imagineers decided it best just to drop the idea of interactivity entirely? Unfortunately for them, it probably wasn't just one issue, but hundreds. And I'm going to try and categorize those as falling into 3 concentric groups: agency versus the individual, agency versus the team, and agency versus the theme park. And that brings us back to the Millennium Falcon. While many of the technical details of how this ride are going to work are still a mystery, there's plenty we can put together from teases, patent filings, and construction photos. 6 guests will board a cockpit of the Millennium Falcon, with each seat having some unique role and task to accomplish. Of course, there won't just be one cockpit, but instead many, that slowly rotate around a central projection hub like a turntable, allowing guests to constantly be loading and unloading when they've completed their trip around the turntable. I originally assumed that the gameplay experience itself would be a simple evolution of what we saw on Horizons, where each crew member would have a moment where they'd be instructed to hit a button or flip a switch, and based on their success or failure, the ride would seamlessly switch over to a new pre-rendered video track to reflect their actions. This was shown not to be the case, however, when recent footage was released discussing Imagineering's partnership with Epic Games and Nvidia, meaning the ride won't be pre-rendered at all, but instead running in real time off the Unreal game engine. Simply put, this ride won't be a dynamic movie, but instead a fully reactive video game environment. For a better demonstration of that huge gap between the two, compare a movie released in 1995, Toy Story, to a big budget game of the year like Chrono Trigger. For all the challenges and costs of achieving visual fidelity, you gain huge functionality in control and variability. For example, while responding to a simple input like flipping a switch is easy with pre-rendered video, it's tasks like steering a ship to avoid obstacles, changing speed to avoid enemy ships, and of course, aiming some cannons that require a real-time engine. This is all to say you're going to be much more involved with piloting the Millennium Falcon than I ever thought possible. While it's exciting to see rides begin to pull inspiration from video games, it brings a litany of complications that would make any designer yearn to go back to the days of Star Tours. The first grouping of these issues are the ones most directly ported over from games, that I'll call agency versus the individual. They all deal with the balancing act of creating an experience for the individual player that feels limitless and free while actually being anything but. Agency versus the individual stems in two obvious directions, and the first takes me back to Telltale's video games, specifically The Walking Dead Season 1. This is a chart of the entirety of that game, showing how all the choices branch out to create a complete narrative tree. In an ideal world, the perfect adventure game narrative graph would probably look very, very different, with each choice branching out to a totally unique direction, splitting off into new splinters, and never converging back towards the center. Even with a short game like a single episode of The Walking Dead, this ideal tree would expand exponentially, creating tens if not hundreds of possible endings. Not only would this be cost prohibitive to develop, but it's spending resources in the worst possible way. Why pour money into painstakingly crafting ending 68 out of 100 if only 1% of players going through the game will ever experience that content? Yet at the same time, limit your tree too much and players start to lose interest and agency as they realize their choices can't ultimately change anything. Games get around this problem by allowing the plot to expand, only to quietly converge back on itself. Sure, maybe the whole timeline fractures at the end of episode 1 when you choose one of two major characters to save, but that divide is ended by the conclusion of episode 3, where the character you saved ends up dying, allowing players to enter episode 4 basically all on the same path. This may feel like an inelegant solution to the problem, but just looking at a graph doesn't get across the emotional investment one can have in their own journey. Speaking only of my own experience, I felt enough ownership over the choices and characters that even if I could have reasoned out that many of my seemingly consequential choices resolved in ways that didn't fundamentally change the overall narrative, I still felt I had crafted my own unique story. This is exactly the balance the Millennium Falcon attraction will have to find. While it'd be fantastic to give players the freedom to visit 5 different planets that each lead to their own unique adventures and branches, every possible path requires untold amounts of development and crafting. The lesson I'd hope the designers take to heart to elevate the feeling of narrative freedom away from the confines of Horizon would be to obscure the limits of your own system. Let the riders feel they could have explored hundreds of places they didn't even see on this one ride, even if we know those hundreds actually loop back to form a more manageable series of possible outcomes. Another challenge to overcome in agency versus the individual is how you manage difficulty. If part of agency is giving riders the power fantasy of being a Star Wars hero, it's easy to see how that could be shattered if you crash into a wall 5 seconds after taking over the controls. At the same time, you also won't feel like much of a legendary pilot if you knew it's impossible to even mess up and hit the wall in the first place. Much like why Mission Space's interactive element felt so pointless, feelings of accomplishment and victory require dramatic stakes. How can we feel good about our own success if we know failure wasn't even a possibility? I think finding the right way to handle difficulty is best compared to bumpers on a bowling alley. Bumpers make it mostly impossible for your ball to slide into the gutter, and yet they don't instantly get you a strike every time. In this way, they reframe the measurement of success away from the binary will I succeed or fail, and towards a more positive outlook of to what degree will I succeed. This type of model can help establish some stakes, without totally disempowering the rider. Even that isn't without complications, however, as the complexity of balancing difficulty gets more complicated when you remember this isn't a single-player journey. Flying the Millennium Falcon will be a co-op experience that you undergo with 5 other riders, and this means managing the agency of everyone all at once. The issues this creates are what I'll define as agency versus the team, and it gets into the messy interpersonal drama of trying to make sure the experience is just as effective, fun, and empowering for everyone who decides to stick out the inevitable 3-hour line. Many of the obvious problems that arise from this type of teamwork are just as evident in cooperative video games. The common problem with the popular shooter Overwatch, or any hero shooter for that matter, is the issue of team composition. The game allows players to choose from a vast array of heroes with their own abilities and skills, but broadly fit into the categories of offensive, defensive, tank, and support. With most teams being random strangers thrown together, it's inevitable that a lot of players will gravitate towards the more flashy and impactful offensive characters, like McCree or Hanzo, rather than the characters who exist to help support the team, like Symmetra or Mercy. The Millennium Falcon will likely replicate this issue by needing 6 unique roles for guests to take up, because at the end of the day, 6 people can't all be behind the steering wheel. While there's some obvious choices, like a gunner or two, maybe someone tracking and destroying incoming projectiles, there's bound to be some inequality between the roles that lead to disappointment. Imagine wading through the massive queue only to be stuck with a job that feels narratively hollow, like activating landing gear, or something mechanically boring, like just flipping a hyperdrive switch when instructed. It's important that all the roles be both equally engaging and narratively important, and that feels like a nigh on impossible task at Imagineer's feet. Another issue that agency versus the team can draw straight from cooperative games of any kind is managing team success and failure. Everyone's had that experience of putting in a great performance only to be massively disappointed when your team loses because your teammates just weren't performing at the same level. This opens up a whole host of questions into how the game will react if some players on your team just aren't able to pull their weight. Imagine a scenario where you're trying to do the job of shooting down enemy ships, and it's made exponentially harder because your ace pilot and Han Solo replacement is a 5-year-old child, or maybe even a completely disinterested 95-year-old grandma. This is made even more dicey by the necessary thought that needs to go into accommodating differently abled riders, who perhaps can't physically or cognitively play along with the interactive elements. These considerations are pretty important when Disney has made it clear that characters out in the larger world of Galaxy's Edge will actually respond to guests and comment on their success or failure of their smuggling voyage. This could be an amazing idea in theory, but in practice, I don't think it would help anyone live out their Star Wars fantasy if they end up being chastised by a bounty hunter for a mission that went awry for reasons totally out of their own control. The obvious way to solve these issues would be to make sure the gameplay of each role is more independent and can be totally fulfilling in its own right. But stray too far in this direction, and you'll be undermining the team dynamic that is core to the fantasy of being part of a spacefaring crew. Another potential way to alleviate some of these issues would be to have a system like Overwatch's medals, which highlight and award individual players for their accomplishments, whether they were on the winning or losing team. This could be done in a ride which presumably has no scoring-based metrics, by having a recognizable character like Poe or Finn show up during the ending sequence to single out a specific rider for doing an especially good job. I've been mostly comparing the Millennium Falcon attraction to video games, but this last grouping of issues, agency versus the theme park, addresses all the concerns that stem from the unique complications of turning a digital interactive experience into a massive physical structure that'll reside inside some of the most visited tourist locations in the entire world. The most straightforward issues here are those related to operations. Basically, the necessity that this attraction has to have the capacity to entertain thousands of guests per hour. One interesting wrinkle is that because of the Omnimover type ride system, the running time for the experience has to be fixed. So no matter how the plot expands, all sequences that branch from the same point will need to have the exact same running time. An interesting consequence of this is the inability for the ride to have any definitive failure states. Imagine playing a game of Mario where no matter what happened, success or failure, each life had to last exactly 2 minutes. This is tied into the issues of difficulty and team cooperation that I discussed earlier, but the inability to have the ride end early if your team fails really limits the designer's ability to provide meaningful consequence and feedback for how you're performing. There may be some missiles headed right towards you, but you can get hit over and over again. It's going to do little to end your mission early. While these are issues related to high capacity, low capacity can also create similarly interesting issues. While Disney will do their best to fill each car, inevitably many cockpits will begin their journey with less than a full crew. It's easy to see how a ride could continue as normal with maybe 5 out of the total 6, but it's difficult to imagine how an interactive ride experience could be just as satisfying with only 1 or 2 players present. There are solutions to this, such as having ride operators selectively turn off roles that aren't going to be available, but this does require new ride systems be created to adapt to any number or any combination of roles. Another way the limitations of the theme park itself impede the power fantasy is the necessity for designing simplistic and naturalistic controls. Game controls are a language all to themselves, and it's jarring for an experienced player to begin a game where shooting is tied to something other than a trigger, or jumping isn't attached to A. Now remember that many people wanting to enjoy the Millennium Falcon attraction have no experience at all with interactive games, let alone the jargon or symbols that they use to explain their control schemes. Each role will need to have such an intuitive control method that any rider of any age, whose first language may not even be English, can quickly figure out exactly what they're supposed to be doing. Assuming the ride has a standard runtime of between 4 and 6 minutes, there really isn't time for an extended tutorial if they want to also cram in lots of familiar characters and locations. I think something along the line of Toy Story Midway Mania's first set of screens, which offer you a chance to shoot targets with no scoring or consequence, could help alleviate this issue. But on the other hand, it's hard to imagine how this would work for potentially more contextual roles, like activating warp to hyperspace. I've thrown out tons of potential speed bumps, so I hope you're starting to see that designing a fulfilling and immersive interactive theme park ride is a lot more difficult than attaching some game controllers onto a dark ride. The complexity of combining so many complicated systems to an experience that needs to be both short and accessible leaves designers with no choice but to make hard decisions about what is actually feasible. Returning back to my Secrets of the Empire VR experience, think about how many different issues the creators are juggling in just my encounter with the locked safe. They had to develop a control scheme and type of gameplay I would approach and immediately understand, tune the difficulty so the puzzle felt manageable under the pressure of simulated blaster fire, but not too easy that it broke the immersion that this was supposedly a secure Imperial facility. They had to create fail-safes so the gameplay couldn't be stopped in its tracks if I couldn't beat the puzzle, and even provide interesting, unique problems for my teammates to deal with simultaneously. This amounts to dozens, if not hundreds of hours of building, testing, iterating, and rebuilding scenarios just to create what amounted to 30 seconds of a 15-minute experience. Despite what it may sound like, I don't want to give the impression that I have,
I got a bad feeling about this.
I want to be cautiously optimistic that Imagineers can solve all the issues I've laid out, and deliver a ride that shows all the dynamic thrills an interactive ride can have. I'd love nothing more for this ride than to offer up the immersive experience of not just riding the movies, but existing inside one of our favorite film franchises. So even if you walk out of the ride not quite feeling like a legendary galactic smuggler, remember that no matter how promising, true narrative agency is always an illusion, and even Disney magic can't solve that problem. Thanks for watching, and if you stuck it out this far, please like, subscribe, and even better, tell me what concerns you have about Galaxy's Edge. And of course, again, thanks for watching.